January 5, 1943. Somewhere over the gray winter spine of occupied France, where the air itself seemed frozen into silence, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s banked through the midday gloom like wolves turning against the wind. The sky that day hung low and colorless, a ceiling of iron pressed down upon the earth. From the cockpits of those sleek German fighters, visibility stretched perhaps 7 miles, maybe 8. Enough to see the contrails before you saw the machines that made them. Enough to judge an opponent by the weight of his shadow against the clouds. The FW-190 pilots, many of them veterans of 2 years across every front from the Channel to the Caucasus, flew with the casual confidence of men who had learned their trade in blood and survived long enough to perfect it. They knew their aircraft. They trusted its broad-shouldered fuselage, its BMW radial engine that could pull them vertical when it mattered, its 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns that could saw the wing off a bomber at 400 meters. They had faced Spitfires over Dover, Hurricanes over Malta, and the early American fighters, those fragile, undergunned P-39s and P-40s that seemed built more for intimidation than actual combat. And they had seen, in recent months, something new appearing in their gun sights, something big, something the Americans were calling the P-47 Thunderbolt. The laughter had started quietly, in the ready rooms and mess halls of Luftwaffe bases scattered across northern France. It began as rumor, then became confirmation, then settled into a kind of dark amusement. The Americans, it seemed, had designed a fighter that weighed 7 tons empty, nearly twice the mass of a Messerschmitt 109, heavier even than some medium bombers. Its fuselage was as wide as a barrel. Its engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, displaced 2,800 cubic inches, and required a turbocharger system so complex it added another half-ton to the airframe. Photographs smuggled through intelligence networks showed a machine that looked less like a fighter and more like a flying barrel. With wings, its cockpit set so far back that American pilots joked they couldn't see over their own nose during takeoff. German intelligence designated it as a heavy fighter, possibly an escort aircraft, certainly not a dogfighter. The consensus among Luftwaffe tacticians was clear. The P-47 might survive high-altitude bomber escort missions through sheer structural strength, but in turning combat, in the kind of knife-fight maneuvering that decided air superiority, it would be a coffin. Gravity and mass were not negotiable. Physics did not favor the heavy. But physics, like war itself, is a matter of context, and the context that winter was shifting in ways the Luftwaffe had not yet fully comprehended. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had evolved into something beyond individual courage or even tactical skill. It had become industrial. The United States Army Air Forces, barely 18 months into full-scale operations against the Reich, were deploying resources on a scale that defied European military logic. American factories were producing aircraft at rates that seemed almost fictional. In 1942 alone, over 47,000 military planes rolled off assembly lines from Seattle to Long Island, each one representing not just metal and rivets, but the concentrated output of a continental economy that had never known occupation, never felt the weight of strategic bombing on its own soil, never faced the choice between producing fighters and feeding its cities. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its ungainly appearance, was the physical manifestation of that abundance. It was not designed to be nimble. It was designed to be lethal and survivable in equal measure. An aircraft that could carry 8.50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 425 rounds, and still climb to 30,000 feet on the strength of an engine that produced 2,000 horsepower in standard configuration and over 2,300 with war emergency boost. It could absorb punishment that would shred a lighter airframe. Its pilot sat behind a slab of bulletproof glass and armor plating thick enough to stop a 20mm shell at oblique angles. And it carried, in those 8 wing-mounted Brownings, a combined rate of fire that could put nearly 100 rounds per second into a target area the size of a barn door. The German pilots, for all their experience, had not yet faced this combination in numbers sufficient to force a doctrinal reckoning. The P-47 had entered combat in limited deployments through late 1942, mostly in defensive patrols and short-range sweeps, where its altitude performance could shine, but its weight remained a handicap. Early encounters had been inconclusive, a few kills on both sides, a general sense among Luftwaffe fighter wings that the Thunderbolt was dangerous if handled conservatively, but vulnerable if pressured into horizontal turning fights. The standard tactical response, refined through 2 years of combat experience, was straightforward. Exploit superior maneuverability, force the engagement into a spiral descent where mass became liability, use hit-and-run attacks from oblique angles to avoid the cone of fire from those 8 guns. It had worked against every American fighter to date. There was no reason to believe the P-47 would be different. Except that the P-47 was different in ways that could not be quantified on a performance chart or simulated in a training exercise. It was different because it represented a shift in aerial combat philosophy, from the European emphasis on agility and climb rate to an American doctrine built around energy retention, diving speed, and overwhelming firepower. It was different because American pilots, many of them trained in the vast clear skies over Texas and Arizona where visibility stretched to the horizon and fuel was never rationed, flew with an aggressive confidence that European combat had not yet beaten out of them. And it was different because, by January 1943, those pilots were no longer green recruits learning their trade under fire. They were men who had survived their first 30 missions, who had seen friends die in burning cockpits, who had learned the cold calculus of air combat where hesitation lasted exactly as long as it took a 20mm shell to cross 800 meters of sky. The mission that would shatter the myth of the Thunderbolt's vulnerability was, on paper, unremarkable. It was logged as a standard fighter sweep. 8 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Fighter Squadron, tasked with flying offensive patrol over the Pas-de-Calais region, seeking targets of opportunity and drawing German fighters away from an inbound bomber stream. The date was January 29, 1943, though some operational records place similar encounters a week earlier in the same operational area. The confusion typical of a period when air combat often occurred beyond the observation of ground witnesses and relied on pilot reports filed hours after landing. Memories still jangling with adrenaline and oxygen deprivation. What is documented with certainty is this: 8 Thunderbolts, led by flight commanders who had learned their lessons in blood over France and the Low Countries, encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s estimated at between 20 and 25 aircraft, operating in loose pairs and pursuing what appeared to be a standard intercept pattern against an unseen bomber group further north. The altitude was 28,000 feet. The temperature outside the cockpits hovered at 40 degrees below zero. Contrails streamed behind every aircraft like white chalk lines drawn against the gray. Visibility, in that thin, cold air, was perfect. What happened next unfolded with a speed that compressed 12 minutes into a kind of violent eternity, the sort of time dilation that pilots would describe in debriefings as everything happening at once and also in slow motion. The German formation, confident in numbers and position, turned into the American fighters with the intention of scattering them through aggressive slashing attacks, a tactic that had worked against every previous Allied fighter type, forcing defensive breaks that split formations and created isolated targets. But the P-47 pilots did not break defensively. Instead, they did something the FW-190 pilots had not anticipated. They dove. The Thunderbolt, for all its bulk, was an exceptional diving aircraft. Its weight, which made it sluggish in level turns, became an asset in vertical maneuvers. Its thick wings and robust airframe could handle speeds that would tear lighter fighters apart. And its engine, force-fed by that complex turbocharger system, maintained power at altitudes where German radials began to gasp. When the 8 American fighters pushed their noses down and opened their throttles to war emergency power, they accelerated past 450 miles per hour in seconds, diving through the altitude band where the FW-190s held position, then pulling up in climbing spirals that used momentum to regain height without sacrificing energy. The German pilots, committed to their attack runs, suddenly found themselves not chasing fleeing targets, but intercepting aircraft that were climbing back into their formation from below. each Thunderbolt presenting a closing angle that negated the FW-190's maneuverability advantage and placed the German fighters squarely in the convergence zone of 64 Browning machine guns. The sound of those guns, recorded in the gun camera footage that survived the mission, was not the sharp chatter of light armament, but a deeper, resonant hammering. The sound of heavy bullets fired in such density that individual reports blurred into a continuous roar. Each .50 caliber round weighed 43 grams and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. At 400 meters, the range where most firing solutions began, those rounds still carried enough energy to penetrate engine blocks, sever control cables, and shatter cockpit frames. The FW-190, designed for frontal attacks against bombers, mounted most of its armor and protection in the forward arc. Its sides and rear were comparatively vulnerable. When the P-47s came up from below, firing in 2 to 3 second bursts, the effect was catastrophic. The first Focke-Wulf to go down was recorded by 3 separate gun cameras, a clean deflection shot that walked rounds from the wing root through the cockpit and out the tail section, the aircraft shuddering in midair as if struck by an invisible hammer, then rolling inverted and beginning the long spiral toward the Earth 9,000 meters below. No parachute emerged. By the time the fighter vanished into the cloud deck, 2 more FW-190s were trailing smoke, one with its engine cowling torn away and streaming glycol, the other flying on shredded ailerons that no longer responded to control inputs. The German formation, so confident 90 seconds earlier, fractured. Pairs broke apart. Some fighters dove for the cloud layer. Others tried to climb, to use altitude as sanctuary, only to find the Thunderbolts could match them meter for meter. The American fighters clawing upward on engine power that seemed limitless, impossible, a violation of everything the Luftwaffe tacticians had predicted. What the German pilots could not have known, sitting in their cockpits with the instrument panels shaking and the radio filled with frantic warnings, was that they were experiencing the first full demonstration of American air combat doctrine as it was meant to be executed. The P-47 was never intended to dogfight in the European sense, to circle and spiral until one pilot made a mistake or ran out of altitude. It was designed to dictate the terms of engagement, to use speed and altitude to attack at will, to disengage when the tactical situation deteriorated, and to absorb punishment during the brief moments when exposure was unavoidable. The 8 American pilots flying that mission had internalized this doctrine not through classroom instruction, but through survival. They had learned, mission by mission, that the Thunderbolt rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. They had learned that diving was not retreating. They had learned that in combat above 20,000 feet, where the air was thin and engines struggled and human reaction time slowed under oxygen deprivation, the fighter that could maintain energy was the fighter that dictated life and death. The engagement lasted 12 minutes from first contact to final separation. In that span, the 8 P-47s destroyed an estimated 23 Focke-Wulf 190s. The number derived from gun camera confirmation, crash site investigations conducted by French resistance units in the following weeks, and Luftwaffe loss records recovered after the war. The American formation lost no aircraft. 2 Thunderbolts returned to base with battle damage, one with a 20mm hole through the vertical stabilizer, another with a severed hydraulic line that forced a wheels-up landing. Both pilots walked away. The P-47's structural strength, that same mass that German pilots had mocked, had absorbed hits that would have downed any other Allied fighter in service. But the significance of that 12-minute engagement transcended the kill ratios and loss statistics. It marked the point where the Luftwaffe's air superiority over occupied Europe, maintained through skill and experience and tactical doctrine refined across 3 years of continuous combat, began to erode under the weight of industrial mathematics. The P-47 was not a better fighter in the abstract sense. Placed in a 1 versus 1 turning engagement at medium altitude, a skilled FW-190 pilot might still hold the advantage. But air combat in 1943 was not an abstract exercise. It was a matter of numbers, of replacement rates, of how many fighters could be put into the air and kept in the air despite losses. By the end of January 1943, Republic Aviation was producing P-47s at a rate of nearly 300 per month. Luftwaffe fighter production, strained by competing demands from the Eastern Front and constrained by raw material shortages, hovered around 400 aircraft per month across all fighter types. The Americans were fielding a single fighter model at 2/3 the rate of total German production, and they were doing so while simultaneously producing bombers, transports, trainers, and every other category of military aircraft. The disparity was not tactical, it was existential. The German pilots who survived that encounter returned to their bases in Normandy and the Pas-de-Calais with a new understanding. The debriefings, recorded in Luftwaffe operational journals, noted a marked increase in caution when engaging P-47 formations. Intelligence assessments revised their evaluation of the Thunderbolt's capabilities, acknowledging its diving speed, firepower, and structural resilience. Tactical recommendations began to emphasize altitude avoidance and disengagement protocols when facing numerically superior Thunderbolt groups. But beneath the clinical language of those reports lay a more profound shift, a psychological erosion that would compound over the following months as more P-47 groups entered combat, as American pilot training programs produced replacement pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could replace its losses, as every mission became a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The laughter, such as it was, stopped. In the mess halls and ready rooms, where German pilots gathered in the hours before dawn to drink bitter ersatz coffee and smoke their rationed cigarettes, the talk turned to survival, to tactics for avoiding engagement rather than seeking it, to the calculus of how many missions a man could fly before the odds caught him. The FW-190 was still a formidable machine. German pilots were still, individually, among the most skilled in the world. But skill and machinery were finite resources. The Americans had learned to replace both faster than they could be depleted. The P-47, that ungainly, barrel-shaped fighter that looked too heavy to turn and too large to hide, had become the visible symbol of that industrial imbalance. Not because it was invincible, but because there were always more of them. Always another flight at altitude, always 8 guns waiting in the sun. The symbolism ran deeper than the pilots themselves understood. Every Thunderbolt that crossed the Channel carried not just ammunition and fuel, but the accumulated output of an economy that measured its production in metrics the European powers could no longer match. Each aircraft represented 30,000 pounds of aluminum, most of it refined from bauxite mined in Arkansas and South America. Each engine required forgings produced in foundries that ran 3 shifts every day without interruption. The .50 caliber ammunition belted into those 8 guns came from factories in Connecticut and Missouri, where teenage girls worked punch presses under fluorescent lights, producing hundreds of thousands of rounds per day while their brothers flew missions over Europe. The rubber and the tires came from plantations in Liberia, the avgas from refineries in Texas, the instruments from workshops in Massachusetts. The P-47 was not a fighter. It was an assembly line with wings, a fragment of American industrial capacity made manifest in aluminum and steel, sent across an ocean to enforce a new reality upon an old continent. The German pilots, for all their courage and skill, were fighting against something they could not outmaneuver or outshoot. They were fighting against capacity itself. The missions continued through February and into March, the P-47 groups flying deeper into occupied territory as their operational range increased with the addition of drop tanks and improved fuel management techniques. The kill ratios stabilized into a pattern. For every Thunderbolt lost in combat, German fighter units were losing 3 to 4 aircraft, sometimes more. The psychological impact compounded the material losses. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting mechanical problems with greater frequency, aborting missions for reasons that ground crews could not always verify. Experienced flight leaders, the men who had trained replacement pilots and maintained tactical cohesion in combat, died at rates the training schools could not match. By mid-1943, the average experience level in German fighter squadrons stationed in France had dropped below 200 combat hours. The Americans, by contrast, were rotating experienced pilots back to the States to serve as instructors, spreading their tactical knowledge across an expanding force structure that would eventually field more than 60 fighter groups in the European theater. The 12-minute engagement over northern France became a case study in American fighter tactics manuals, its lessons distilled into training doctrine and disseminated to every P-47 group entering combat. The gun camera footage was analyzed frame by frame, the firing solutions and energy management techniques taught to cadets who had never seen Europe, who practiced their diving attacks over the deserts of Arizona and the forests of Georgia, who learned that altitude was life and speed was power, and mass was not a weakness but a weapon. The German tactical response, such as it was, evolved toward avoidance. Strict orders against engaging P-47 formations unless holding overwhelming numerical or positional advantage, increased reliance on hit-and-run attacks from high altitude, a defensive posture that conceded air superiority in everything but name. But beyond the tactical and industrial dimensions, beyond the statistics of production and loss, the encounter carried a human weight that numbers alone could not convey. Every Focke-Wulf that went down that day carried a man, a pilot, who had trained for months or years, who had survived the Eastern Front or the Mediterranean, who had perhaps believed that his skill and his aircraft would be enough to hold back the Allied advance. The German aviation community was small enough that losses were personal. Squadrons knew each other, had trained together, had shared the same airfields and instructors. When 23 fighters failed to return from a single engagement, it was not a statistical abstraction. It was 24 empty chairs in ready rooms scattered across occupied France, 24 letters written by commanding officers to families in Hamburg and Munich and Berlin, 24 funerals conducted in military cemeteries where the graves already outnumbered the living. The Luftwaffe, in early 1943, was still capable of local tactical victories, still capable of inflicting painful losses on Allied bomber formations, still fielding pilots whose individual skill exceeded that of most of their opponents. But it was losing the war of attrition, losing the war of replacement, losing the psychological war, where every mission became a roll of dice weighted against survival. The American pilots, for their part, carried their own burdens. They returned from missions with gun camera footage that showed aircraft disintegrating, wings folding, fuselages tumbling through the sky. They flew through debris fields where men had died seconds earlier, navigated clouds of smoke and debris that had been living human beings. They landed at bases in England and climbed out of cockpits stained with hydraulic fluid and spent brass casings, and they went to debriefings where intelligence officers asked clinical questions about angles and altitudes and ammunition expenditure. And then they went to their quarters and slept or did not sleep, and 6 hours later they flew another mission. The ones who survived long enough to complete their tour rotated home to train the next generation, passing on the hard lessons. Don't turn when you can dive. Don't hesitate when you have the shot. Don't stay in the fight longer than necessary, because hesitation and overconfidence killed with equal efficiency. And they carried with them, conscious or not, the knowledge that they were flying missions in aircraft their country could replace faster than they could be destroyed, burning fuel their economy could produce in functionally unlimited quantities, firing ammunition manufactured at scales that defied comprehension. They were not better men than the Germans they fought, but they were equipped by a nation that had turned its entire industrial capacity toward the single purpose of projecting power across oceans, and that advantage was, in the final analysis, insurmountable. By the summer of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become the most widely deployed American fighter in the European theater, with operational groups stationed across England and North Africa. Its nickname, Jug, short for Juggernaut, had shifted from mild derision to something like respect, the kind of nickname soldiers give to weapons they trust. Pilots who had transitioned from P-40s or Spitfires spoke of the Thunderbolt's stability, its capacity to absorb damage, the sense of security that came from sitting behind armor plate and bulletproof glass. They spoke less often of the weight, which had ceased to matter once tactics adapted to exploit the aircraft's strengths. The Luftwaffe, for its part, issued periodic tactical bulletins reminding pilots that the P-47 remained vulnerable under specific conditions: tight horizontal turns below 15,000 feet, attacks from directly above that negated its diving advantage, coordinated assaults by multiple aircraft that could overwhelm even the Thunderbolt's defensive firepower. But these tactical recommendations increasingly read like wishful thinking, instructions for engagements that occurred less frequently as American fighter sweeps grew larger and German fighter strength attrited. The transformation was both material and symbolic. The P-47 had become proof that industrial capacity could be weaponized as effectively as any tactical innovation, that the nation capable of outbuilding its opponents did not need to outfight them in the traditional sense. The American military-industrial complex, for all its inefficiencies and bureaucratic inertia, had produced a fighter that embodied the principle of overwhelming material advantage. Not the best aircraft in any single performance metric, but the best combination of survivability, firepower, and producibility. It was a fighter designed not for the duel, but for the campaign, not for the individual ace, but for the group mission, not for glory, but for the grinding attrition that modern industrial war demanded. And in that sense, the 12-minute engagement over northern France in January 1943 was less a battle than a revelation, a moment when the theoretical predictions of staff officers and production planners became visceral reality in the sky above occupied Europe. The FW-190 pilots who survived learned that day what their high command was only beginning to acknowledge: that the war in the air was no longer being decided by tactical brilliance or individual courage, but by the cold mathematics of production capacity and replacement rates, by the ability of one nation to lose 1,000 aircraft and field 2,000 more, while its opponent lost 100 and struggled to replace 50. The laughter, that bitter amusement at the P-47's ungainly shape, had been born of a misunderstanding, a belief that air combat remained a contest of maneuver and skill where the better aircraft flown by the better pilot would always prevail. But by 1943, air combat had become something else entirely. It had become industrial. It had become attritional. It had become a matter of which nation could sustain losses longer, which economy could produce replacement aircraft faster, which training system could cycle pilots through at rates sufficient to maintain operational tempo despite casualties that would have been unthinkable in earlier wars. The Germans, for all their tactical sophistication and engineering excellence, were fighting an enemy who measured success not in aces and kill ratios, but in monthly production figures and operational availability rates. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose 100 fighters in a single day and launch 100 more the next morning. They were fighting an enemy whose factories had never been bombed, whose cities had never been occupied, whose civilian population supported the war effort with a certainty born of distance and ideology and a kind of messianic faith in American abundance. The Germans, for all their tactical sophistication and engineering excellence, were fighting an enemy who measured success not in aces and kill ratios, but in monthly production figures and operational availability rates. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose 100 fighters in a single day and launch 100 more the next morning. They were fighting an enemy whose factories had never been bombed, whose cities had never been occupied, whose civilian population supported the war effort with a certainty born of distance and ideology and a kind of messianic faith in American abundance. P-47 Thunderbolt, that 7-ton fighter that looked too heavy to fight, became the physical manifestation of that abundance. It was not elegant. It was not beautiful in the aesthetic sense that European engineers understood, but it was effective in the way that only American engineering could be effective. Brutally functional, overwhelmingly powerful, and produced in numbers that made individual losses tactically irrelevant. By the end of the war, Republic aviation would produce more than 15,000 Thunderbolts, each one carrying 8 guns and the accumulation weight of an industrial economy that had never doubted its capacity to outbuild any opponent on Earth. The German pilots stopped laughing because there was nothing left to laugh at. The joke, if it had ever been one, had become a requiem. And in the decades after, when historians and veterans gathered to discuss the air war over Europe, the question was never whether the P-47 was a great fighter in the classical sense. The question was whether greatness, in modern industrial war, had anything to do with elegance or maneuverability or aesthetic beauty. The answer, written in gun camera footage and loss reports and the empty chairs at Luftwaffe bases across occupied France, was that greatness had become something else, something measured in production capacity and replacement rates, and the ability to sustain losses that would have broken any previous generation's conception of acceptable cost. The P-47 was great because it was many. It was great because it was there, day after day, mission after mission, absorbing losses and replacing them faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was great because it turned air combat into arithmetic, And in arithmetic, the side with more numbers eventually prevails. The 12 minutes over northern France in January 1943 were not the moment America won the air war. That victory would take 2 more years of grinding attrition, of bomber streams and escort missions and tactical innovations and terrible losses on both sides. But it was the moment when the outcome became inevitable, when the industrial disparity that had always existed in theory became undeniable in practice, when the Luftwaffe's tactical excellence met American material abundance and discovered that excellence, however refined, could not overcome the simple fact of being outnumbered and outproduced by an economy 3 times its size operating at full wartime capacity. The sky over Europe, which had been contested for 4 years, began its slow turn toward Allied control. And the P-47, that ungainly, barrel-shaped fighter that looked like it belonged on a factory floor rather than in a dogfight, became the instrument of that transformation. Not because it was perfect, but because it was enough, and because there were always more of them. Always another flight climbing through the cold January sky. Always 8 guns waiting in the sun.